During your visit to Bangladesh, you met with Professor Yunus.
And to talk with him candidly about some of the challenges that Bangladesh is facing.
You and your colleague work for Right to Freedom. Can you tell us a little more? Is it a Bangladesh?
Well, both Ambassador Milam and I have been fortunate to have had long-standing personal and professional relationships with Professor Yunus. We weren't asking anything from him. We were offering our suggestions, our advice.
Bangladesh after the 5th July uprising is the propaganda against Bangladesh. Many were directed from the neighboring India.
That clearly there is violence in Bangladeshi society, including violence that gets directed at vulnerable populations.
After the fall of the Hasina regime, due to the 17 year of brutal oppression that the people faced, there was a reaction from the people.
Our focus is to look at human rights and democracy issues.
5th August revolution, the police was not functioning properly.
That during that initial period at the end of the Hasina regime, before the interim government had fully taken over the reins of power.
After Mr. Trump got elected, when Prime Minister Modi was meeting him in the White House,
I'm certain that the Trump administration will get around to coming up with a specific policy towards South Asia.
what are the best ways for Bangladesh to come to a good terms with Mr. Trump's trade policies and trade wars?
Perspective of a country like Bangladesh and Bangladesh's garment producers, they need to compete with the world on price and quality.
Do you think his initiatives of attracting more Chinese investment to the country?
That this is not a normal government. This is an interim government. Obviously, Professor Yunus brought to this position.
For this Yunus government, the people's blood was their legitimacy.
I certainly view this as a legitimate government.
Many of them wants this government or Dr. Muhammad Yunus to lead at least 5 more years.
I think it's not possible
Can you expand on more on this? Why do you think that?
because that consensus does not exist.
Welcome, audience. Jon Danilowicz is a former U.S. diplomat and former deputy ambassador to Bangladesh. After his retirement, he has been working in different issues in Bangladesh, keeping a very close eye what is happening in Bangladesh and how Bangladesh is performing in terms of international relations. Today, we are very pleased to invite him in our virtual studio. Welcome, John.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to be back again.
Yeah, I remember our conversation a couple of months ago, and we are very happy to get you one more time in our show. John, very recently, you and your team, including former U.S. Ambassador to Bangladesh, William Milam, visited Bangladesh very recently after 5th August revolution, and you met very key personalities in Bangladesh, including the chief advisor, Dr. Yunus. Can you tell me a little more about your visit? What was the purpose? Who are the key person and entities you met, and what was your agenda?
So it had been about 10 years since I had last been in Bangladesh. I finished my last assignment in 2014, and my family had remained in Bangladesh from 2014 to 15 while I was in Peshawar. So I had a chance to visit them then. But when I left in 2015, I hadn't returned to Bangladesh until my most recent visit at the beginning of March. When I was in my diplomatic career, when I was posted overseas, I always used to tell everyone who visited that the moment you step foot in a country, you know more than everyone back in Washington. Because there is no substitute really for being on the ground, talking with people, sitting with them, and exchanging views. So I had been following Bangladesh very closely over the past several years, with particular interest since the July Revolution. But I knew that it was important to visit Dhaka to have a chance to talk with people directly. So Ambassador Milam and I, along with one of our colleagues from Right to Freedom, planned a visit, and we had an extraordinary 2 weeks in Dhaka. It far exceeded our expectations. We hoped to see old friends, which we did. We hoped to connect with new friends, which we did. And we hoped to make connections with institutions that we had been working with Right to Freedom, and others that we thought we had an opportunity to work with. So, again, the visit exceeded all of our expectations. We received a very warm welcome from the people of Bangladesh, as I would have expected. We were there during the holy month of Ramadan, which for me was more of a month of feasting than fasting, as again, we were overwhelmed by Bangladeshi hospitality. And I think we left with a much better and more nuanced view of what's happening in Bangladesh, both the opportunities and the challenges facing the country, not just now during this interim period, but going forward past the elections that are likely to take place, within the next year.
Mhm. Great to hear. You mentioned about the organization you and your colleague work for, Right to Freedom. Can you tell us a little more? Is it a Bangladesh focused organization? What does it do?
Sure. Well, the organization was founded just a few years back, actually during the pandemic. I joined the organization after retiring. So after the organization had already been in existence for a couple of years. It's a nonprofit organization in U.S. It's a 501(c)(3) organization. It was founded and funded by a small group of volunteers, many of whom continue to be associated with the organization. Our president is former U.S. Ambassador to Bangladesh and Pakistan, Ambassador William Milam. And our focus is to look at human rights and democracy issues. Our scope is South Asia as a whole, but for reasons of both resources and because of what's been happening, we've focused almost exclusively on Bangladesh during our first couple of years. Up until the events of July and August, we weren't really sure how much impact we would be able to have after the 2004 elections had gone in a way that we thought would just perpetuate the non-democratic rule. So we were starting to think about other areas that we could focus on, including other countries in the region. But after the historic events of July and August, we soon realized that there was lots of work still to be done in Bangladesh. So that continues to be our primary, almost exclusive focus.
Okay. Great to hear, John. During your visit to Bangladesh, you met with Professor Yunus. What did you guys discuss? How long was the meeting? And is there any scope of collaboration you established with the government as well?
Sure. Well, both Ambassador Milam and I have been fortunate to have had long-standing personal and professional relationships with Professor Yunus. For Ambassador Milam, this goes back 3 decades to his first tenure as ambassador in Dhaka. For myself, I didn't have the opportunity to interact with Professor Yunus during my first assignment in Bangladesh, but certainly during my time in Bangladesh, beginning in the mid 2000s, I had the opportunity to interact with him and his team on a regular basis. So for us, this was an opportunity to renew an old acquaintance, to meet with an old friend, and to talk with him candidly about some of the challenges that Bangladesh is facing, to offer our support in our limited ways to help Bangladesh move through this period and to help build and consolidate a democracy. So we had a very pleasant meeting. We were together for almost an hour, and Professor Yunus was extremely generous with his time. And again, I think as with many of his meetings with old friends, we were able to um, talk about a broad range of issues. And maybe the difference between our meeting and some of the other ones that Professor Yunus has in his current position is that we weren't asking anything from him. We were offering our suggestions, our advice, our assistance, and I think he took the meeting in that spirit.
Okay, perfect. One more question, John, if you don't mind. You did mention that this is the first time in 10 years that you returned to Bangladesh, right?
Hmm.
Now, during the last regime of Bangladesh, during the Sheikh Hasina's rule, many of the cities, even the Bangladeshi citizens who live abroad, they didn't feel safe going back there due to all these extrajudicial abductions and the famous Ainagor incident and the law
Hmm.
and order. Now, this is out of my personal curiosity. The foreign nationals and diplomats like yourself, did you feel during these last 10 years or 15 years after your retirement, due to your role for a pro democracy stand, and you mentioned about the sham elections as well, that you could get some of the reciprocal actions from the regime, and that's the reason you didn't feel safe to go return in last 10 years?
Yeah, it wasn't really a question of not feeling safe. To be honest, I didn't apply for a visa. I didn't apply for permission to visit Bangladesh during the last regime. I don't know if I would have been granted a visa. Certainly, I don't believe that my visit would have been welcomed. I certainly wouldn't have been welcomed by the Bangladesh government the way Ambassador Milam and I were during this period. But beyond that, as I thought about potentially visiting Bangladesh, I thought about what that visit would look like during the previous government. And what I realized from what I had heard from so many friends about the oppressive nature of the regime, the increase in surveillance, the increased harassment that people faced for speaking their minds, that I would have likely put many of my friends in a very difficult and uncomfortable position. They probably wouldn't have felt as free talking to me. They probably would have felt somewhat inhibited from meeting. So to not put them in a difficult place and recognizing the reality, um, we decided, and I decided that there wasn't much value to visiting during that time. I would remember, for example, during the period when my friends in Bangladesh would travel outside the country, they'd be in Thailand or
To meet
Singapore
you?
or the United Kingdom or someplace, they would occasionally call me from a foreign number, and they would feel that they could talk to me, via Signal or WhatsApp or another program when they were outside the country. But then
Mhm.
they were clear to me that once they returned to Bangladesh, they wouldn't have the same freedom to interact with me. That was markedly different, obviously, this time when I was able to meet with people across the spectrum. We had very free and open conversations in private, in public. And in some ways, the old Bangladesh, which I remembered, was very much present when I was back during this past visit.
Yeah, great to hear. Uh, Another very important aspect of the recent changes of Bangladesh after the 5th July uprising is the propaganda against Bangladesh. Many were directed from the neighboring India. And one of the key propaganda was the treatment of minority, the treatment of women. You spent a lot of time in Bangladesh in official capacity, then you visited after 5th August revolution. Did you notice any large scale oppression on the minorities or the role of women are threatened during your visit?
Yeah. So again, just to be clear, I was in Bangladesh for about 2 weeks. We only stayed in Dhaka. While we met with as many people as we could, the reality is I probably met, dozens, maybe scores of people. But in a country of 180 million people, again, I was looking at things through a soda straw. So my direct impressions were limited to what I was able to do. That said, I think I was able in my 2 weeks to draw some conclusions, again, drawing on my previous experience in the country as well. So based on what I saw and what I heard, in some ways I saw more continuity than I saw differences. So on the issue, for example, of violence against minorities, or involving members of minority communities. I was first posted in Bangladesh in 1990 to 92, and at that point I had responsibility for the human rights portfolio. So I looked very closely at human rights issues, including the issues that we just discussed. These issues were important issues during my subsequent assignments as well. So, in some ways, some of the patterns that I see are very similar. That clearly there is violence in Bangladeshi society, including violence that gets directed at vulnerable populations, including members of minority groups and women. I did not get the sense that at the time I was visiting, the level of violence was any different than what I had seen during previous times. Several people remarked to me what I had heard from others, that during that initial period at the end of the Hasina regime, before the interim government had fully taken over the reins of power, there was a vacuum in which law enforcement had disappeared from the scene. There were feuds that were settled, whether those were political or local or personal in nature. And certainly there were a higher than normal number of incidents of violence at that period. Um, but since then, and including up until the present day, my sense is that many of the same conflict dynamics exist in Bangladesh today as have existed in the past. And this is where I think the propaganda and the disinformation are particularly worrisome because by exaggerating the extent of the problem, what it does is it detracts attention from the real issues. And I'll give you just one example. There was a two-part BBC documentary that looked at this issue of violence against minority communities, and then this aired several months back. And when it first came out, a lot of pro-Awami League or pro-Indian outlets um, amplified this to say, aha, here's the smoking gun, here's the evidence. But what most people didn't do is actually take the time to watch the documentary and to see what they said. And again, the portrait that I think the BBC painted was very similar to what I would have thought would be the case, that there are incidents of violence. There are also incidents or examples of when Muslim members of a community look out for their Hindu neighbors and shelter them, where other dynamics are at play when there are incidents of violence. So again, it's a much more complicated picture, which also has to do with the fundamental weaknesses of Bangladesh's criminal justice system, which have been identified by the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, and other observers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's correct. It's important that you mentioned that to look at the thing from different angle. There are many underlying reasons behind an incident that usually is not considered. For example, during this Hasina regime, after the fall of the Hasina regime, due to the 17 year of brutal oppression that the people faced, there was a reaction from the people, and that the reaction went towards the ex-ministers and high officials of the Hasina regime, along with his party member who were brutal to their locality. Now, if that very party man were a Muslim, he was not spared, right? His house was vandalized. If that party member was Hindus or other minorities, they are not considered as a Hindu and then attacked. They were just considered as tools of the brutal regime. Now, after the uprising, it's a natural consequence, right? You cannot ignore all this social economic factor and just take that as a religious factor. Would you agree?
No, I agree very much with that analysis. Now, at the same time, this doesn't mean that mob violence is ever acceptable. It also doesn't mean that individuals who are accused of crimes aren't also entitled to their rights. So this is, I think, the bigger challenge that Bangladesh faces, that even as the 1 year anniversary of the July Revolution, the July Uprising approaches, people still have this very strong desire that there be justice and accountability for the crimes that were committed. So this is important, and those processes are underway. It's also important that they be done correctly, which is why I think it's taking some time. But more broadly, even beyond the accountability through the criminal justice system for those who committed crimes, there's a broader societal issue of how you promote truth and reconciliation and healing. Because there's a variety of levels of complicity, from those who ordered or committed the crimes directly to those who may have enabled or looked the other way or somehow benefited from the prevailing situation. So understandably, on a number of different levels, there's a desire to see justice and accountability.
Mhm.
But the way in which society goes about trying to achieve these goals is also very important.
Mhm. That is correct. Also, I think there is a you are absolutely right on the point that regardless of the atrocity committed, nobody should take the law in their own hand. But also, like we have to keep in consider, we are living in the West where the police system is very separated than the party governance, and they can work kind of independently in many ways. In Bangladesh, in the countries of South Asia, sometimes there is no standard policing and the judicial system. They influence too much. So as you rightly mentioned, after the 5th July revolution, 5th August revolution, the police was not functioning properly, right? That created a vacuum for many people to demonstrate their revenge the way they did. So that is definitely to be considered as well. um, uh, Now, great concern after Mr. Trump got elected here due to his one of the tweet he put it out right before the election. We talked about it in
Mhm.
our previous show. After Mr. Trump got elected, when Prime Minister Modi was meeting him in the White House, one of the Indian journalists asked a question to Trump, and Trump's response met with a lot of dual meaning. Some people took his response as of he is handing over Bangladesh affair to Mr. Modi. Some of them interpreted it as Trump didn't want to answer the question directly and let Mr. Modi answer the question. How do you interpret that very response from Mr. Trump?
Yep. No, so I agree. So at the time, there were different interpretations of what President Trump's comments meant. And those interpretations often reflected the prejudices of those giving the interpretations. But since the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, we've had several data points that we can draw upon. For example, there were the messages that both President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio issued on the occasion of Bangladesh's Independence Day. And both of these were relatively warm messages, even though these are standard protocol messages. I think you can read into both of them that in both cases, Secretary of State Rubio and President Trump stressed the desire to develop a strong relationship with Bangladesh. And then you look at some of the other actions that the Trump administration has taken. While not all of these actions have necessarily shown favor to Bangladesh, at the same time, nothing that President Trump or the administration have done have singled out Bangladesh. So even, for example, on the tariff issue, which we may talk some more about, um, Bangladesh was treated no differently than any other country when it came to the initial decision to impose tariffs. And then when the tariff relief or the temporary pause was granted, again, Bangladesh was in the category of those states that were given that reprieve. So if the Trump administration had wanted to send a signal to Bangladesh that there was some level of displeasure with how Bangladesh was acting, there have been several opportunities since the meeting with Prime Minister Modi for the Trump administration to do that, and they haven't done so. So again, the interpretation I take is that at present, the Trump administration is still developing its specific policies with regard to South Asia and with regard to Bangladesh. So what we have thus far are the broad principles that the Trump administration has articulated for its foreign policy priorities. And I give credit to Bangladesh's interim government to the fact that they've paid attention to those, they've responded appropriately, and in cases where it's mattered for Bangladesh, for example, restoration of humanitarian assistance for Rohingya refugees, they were able to make a compelling case that this assistance was necessary and that some transition period was important while other sources of funding were identified. So, again, I think thus far, those who think that the Trump administration is interested in having a workable relationship with Bangladesh have the weight of evidence on their side, and those who believe somehow that that the Indian government or Prime Minister Modi had convinced President Trump to take a harder line or to defer to India's wishes when it came to Bangladesh, I don't think there's any evidence to back that up, other than again people trying to parse these few words at a press availability.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned about the forming of the South Asian policy from Mr. Trump's cabinet or Trump's team. Who are the key people that makes this policy? Do you know? Even if their titles are not the names.
Yeah, well, so again, each administration has a range of policies. I mean, there's the overall national security policy, the underlying, defense and security policies that go along with that. Um, I'm certain that the Trump administration will get around to coming up with a specific policy towards South Asia, and there'll be some indications of specific policy initiatives with regard to Bangladesh. We will likely see these first articulated when the Assistant Secretary of State nominee for South and Central Asia has his confirmation hearings. I don't know that those dates have yet been firmed up, but that would be an opportunity, I think, for the Trump administration through the State Department to speak about its interests in South Asia and with regard to Bangladesh. So, again, there are people at the White House, at the National Security Council, who have responsibility for Asia and South Asia. A number of those people are already in place. There'll be people at the State Department and throughout the bureaucracy. Of course, we don't currently have a confirmed U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh in Dhaka. We're ably represented in Bangladesh by a career diplomat who has been herself a three-time ambassador elsewhere, Ambassador Tracy Jacobson, who's there as the charge d'affaires. So the embassy in Dhaka is carrying out the work that it would normally be expected to
Mhm.
do. But again, we haven't had a nominee for ambassador who, again, would have that opportunity to have a Senate confirmation hearing and to speak specifically about the Trump administration's priorities with regard to Bangladesh. And I don't expect that we'll have somebody in that position for probably some time still.
Yeah, great. Now, in terms of Mr. Trump administration's concern about Bangladesh, especially the minority treatment, after Mr. Trump's tweet,
Mhm.
uh, one of his peak, very important peak, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, when she was speaking to the Indian media and was tackling one of the questions from the journalist about the treatment of the minorities in Bangladesh, she did express her concern, and she did mention Trump administration's concern about the, in her own words, the ill treatment of the minorities. How do you interpret that? Do you think that Tulsi Gabbard was not representing Mr. Trump's administration concern, but just merely uh, articulating her own narrative on the point? How do you interpret the whole interview?
Well, again, if you look at what the director of national intelligence said, she reiterated longstanding concerns. And if you look at both her previous statements when she was not in this position, including when she was a member of Congress and when she was a private citizen, she has spoken for a number of years about concerns about treatment of minority communities and the potential for Islamic extremism in Bangladesh. When she was a member of Congress during the Awami League period, she introduced or co-sponsored a resolution on this effect. So she was, I think, restating what had been long-standing concerns of hers as an individual, yet at the same time, she was reflecting long-standing concerns of the US government. If you look back any number of years, these are issues which the US government has spoken out on regularly. Again, both the issue of treatment of minority communities as well as risks of extremism, not just in Bangladesh, but in many countries as well. So I don't think that it's fair to interpret her remarks as somehow specifically referring to developments since the interim government has taken office. There's certainly nothing new in that in terms of the Trump administration's concerns. Now, from the government of Bangladesh's perspective, I think it was an excellent idea for the chief advisor to reach out to the director of national intelligence directly and to invite her to visit Bangladesh to see the situation for herself. And soon thereafter, there was a visit by a US Senator, Gary Peters, who went to Bangladesh. And one of the things that I sensed during my own visit to Dhaka was this degree of openness that the Yunus administration has put forward and the signal that they've sent to the world that whether it's for journalists, foreign government officials, academics, researchers, that Bangladesh is open, that if somebody wants to come and visit, they're welcome. They can see for themselves the situation and draw their own conclusions. So, again, this attitude, I think, stands in stark contrast to the attitude during the previous government.
Mm, right. And I guess the attitude of the previous government was fully to ignore or like point your finger even the other directions and something like that. Um, uh, Coming back to the trade war, you already mentioned about the tariff, and there is nothing outstanding in terms of Bangladesh. It was how Mr. Trump is viewing his negotiations across the country in terms of tariff. Uh, for Bangladesh, right, it will be devastating to get the extra any more tariff, especially the ready-made garment sector. The facilities it is now enjoying with USA trade relationship, any extra tariff will definitely not be helpful. What is your idea, working as a US diplomat for a long time and observing Bangladesh's political and economic situation? What are the best ways for Bangladesh to come to a good terms with Mr. Trump's trade policies and trade wars?
Yeah, so I should start by saying that I'm not an economist. So I have very much a layman's perspective on this. But I think you have to take a step back and look at the issue of Bangladesh's exports to the United States in certain categories. So, say garments, for example. So, at the end of the day, the US consumer makes decisions about what they want to purchase. those decisions are made based on a number of factors. They're made based on price, obviously, is a consideration, and quality is a consideration.
Mhm.
And the retailers, those who purchase these products from abroad, make decisions based on what they think the consumer wants. So, from a perspective of a country like Bangladesh and Bangladeshi's garment producers, they need to compete with the world on price and quality. Now, when the pricing comes in, that's where the tariffs matter. So there, it's not a question of absolute tariffs; it's a question of relative tariffs, and it also has to do with the alternatives, including U.S. manufacturing. So certainly, if there were a situation in which Bangladesh's exports to the United States faced significantly higher tariffs than imports from other countries, that could potentially put Bangladesh's exports at a disadvantage. Again, there are other factors, cost factors that go into play, um, transportation costs, labor costs, material costs. So I don't think that just the number of what level of tariff is imposed on Bangladesh's exports tells you what's going to happen necessarily. It has to do with kind of the relative um, tariffs on Bangladeshi goods versus goods from other countries. And it also has to do with what alternatives there are for US domestic production, and then how much the American consumer is willing to spend. All right, so it's a complicated set of issues. At the end of the day, the Trump administration has domestic policy priorities, which include, to some extent, revitalizing domestic manufacturing capacity in a number of areas. So, to some extent, the Trump administration's policies are meant to stimulate domestic production. In some categories, that's probably more likely than others. I don't know if it's realistic that an apparel industry will ever reemerge in the United States, or whether just because of the nature of the world economy, those products will always be sourced overseas. Bangladesh has some important competitive advantages, even in comparison with other potential producers. One of these at present is the amount of capacity that Bangladesh's industry has, which others don't have. So it's not that easy, for example, for a buyer in the United States to switch orders from Bangladesh to another country if another country doesn't have the installed capacity. So I think the approach that the Bangladesh government has taken and that the Bangladesh industry has taken is the right one, is to take the Trump administration seriously, to try to understand the Trump administration's concerns, not just about the tariff rates in Bangladesh, but also the trade deficit and issues related to non-tariff barriers. The government of Bangladesh, Professor Yunus, have indicated a desire and a willingness to sit with the American side to talk about these issues. And in the meantime, the Bangladesh industry is going to continue to look for ways to make itself more competitive. So I don't think it's time to push the panic button. And I don't think that this presages necessarily a collapse of Bangladeshi exports. I think what it means, though, is that there's a new reality in the world, and Bangladesh, like other countries, has to adjust to that.
Mhm. Yeah, a great response. Actually, you were right because I was myself watching a documentary I remember a couple of years ago where the documentary was focusing on how the US factories and factory jobs has been abolished over the years because big corporations like Walmart and others have been ordering from China and wherever they find it cheaper. So the local factories couldn't compete in terms of price, in terms of quality. The American produced goods are far more better, but in terms of the price, it's so cheap that people start buying the foreign imported goods from the big shops like Walmart's, and eventually the local facilities and factories dried up. And the same factory worker who was making a good living through their factory jobs are now being employed by Walmart and Costco and getting half of what they were making them. So it would be a good step from Mr. Trump and his administration if they could bring back those factory jobs and the factory production inside of a USA for US economy itself, for sure. But do you think that is the goal of Mr. Trump's trade war to bring back some of the factory jobs and factories and manufacturing inside of the USA, or what does he want to achieve via this?
Yeah, so again, I'm not an expert on this, but from what I've seen, certainly there's an element of that. And I think the experience during the COVID pandemic exposed some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the US economy. when global supply chains were interrupted and we had shortages in critical materials in the United States. That demonstrated that this loss of manufacturing capacity in the United States had some real world implications. And there are other scenarios one can foresee in the future in which, again, these global supply lines could be interrupted and the US could again find itself in a vulnerable situation. So there are a number of factors domestically in terms of the future of our country, the future of our economy, the future of our society. And President Trump was elected by a majority of the American people who bought into his vision for how to make America great again in his terms, how to put America first. So nothing that President Trump is doing should take people by surprise in terms of his broad priorities. Now, some of the tactics and strategies that he and his team are employing may not have been anticipated, but I think in the broadest scope, what President Trump is doing is what he said he was going to do. And I think, he has the opportunity now to show the American people that his vision for the future and his policies will yield the best results for them. If he's not successful in doing so, then in subsequent elections, others can put forward different priorities and different options.
Yeah, yeah. Recently, we have seen that Dr. Yunus, the chief advisor of Bangladesh, his recent visit to the China, his negotiations with Myanmar and BIMSTEC. He's getting some success there, definitely. The Chinese premier met him, and it was a very warm welcome from their end. Dr. Yunus has been seen a good friend and ally of the West. Do you think his initiatives of attracting more Chinese investment to the country, negotiating with Myanmar, and moving towards more of a Asian countries like them will create any challenges in terms of how he wants to balance the relationship between West and China, given that West and China doesn't go along with many of the policies?
Well, I think all of us, whenever we're in any position, we bring to that position who we are as individuals, and then we assume the characteristics that that position requires for us. So, for example, when I served as a US diplomat, obviously I brought my previous experiences to the table, but at the same time, I was very conscious of what my responsibilities were given the position. So I think the same holds true for Professor Yunus and others in his government. They bring their life experiences, but they have a role to play and they understand those roles. Obviously, Professor Yunus brought to this position a vast global network and vast global experience. So, in some ways, I think he has been able to use those to both his advantage and to the government's advantage. That said, I think we have to step back and remember that this is not a normal government. This is an interim government. So Professor Yunus and his team have basically two responsibilities. The overriding responsibility is to hold free and fair elections that will usher in an elected successor government. Um, in order to get to that point, there are some critical political and economic reforms that they need to push through. And at the same time, begin the process of holding those who committed crimes in the past accountable, not just for the sake of justice, but also in order to help ensure that future governments don't act like the previous government did. Now, as they're trying to carry out those tasks, they obviously have to govern on a day-to-day basis. But that's not their priority, and it's not their most important role. So if you look at this administration, um, it's already has the clock running out on it in some ways. I mean, Professor Yunus has said elections will take place either by the end of this calendar year or at the latest June of next year. My own personal view, based on my visit to Bangladesh, is it's more likely that it'll be sooner rather than later in terms of that time frame. So I'm anticipating that elections will likely take place toward the end of this year, December, January, which really means that this government only has another 8 or 9 months left to go. If elections are held or if election schedules announced 3 months in advance, um, so that maybe means September or so. What that means is that there's only 5 or 6 months left for this government to govern. So just because of the nature of time, there's a limited amount it can accomplish. So in many ways, what this government is doing is serving as a bridge between what was the case in the past and what will be the case in the future. So on many of these broader issues of international relations and foreign policy, I think what Professor Yunus and his team are doing what needs to be done at present, addressing the priorities of the day, but in some ways teeing things up for the next government to take the situation forward. So I don't see anything that this government is doing in terms of a major initiative on the foreign policy front, because I think they understand that that's not really their role.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned about the duration of this government, where you were right in terms of the some of the tentative deadline put forward even by the chief advisor when the election will be holding. But there is another voice among the country from many of the members of the common people and some intellectual like Farhad Majur and the newly formed political party NCP. Many of them wants this government or Dr. Muhammad Yunus to lead at least 5 more years, and they are rational for this claim is that first of all, good governance. I don't know if you know, during the last Ramadan, when the general trend of the groceries to go up the last Ramadan, it didn't go up. So people were expressing their satisfaction on the pricing on the daily groceries and markets. The second is how Dr. Yunus is ruling the country in terms of the foreign policies. Like he has been telling the Rohingya people that I hope you can do your next Eid, the Muslim celebration of the biggest festive, in your own land. He indicating Myanmar. So um, um, another rationale put forward by this intellectual that I just mentioned is the mandate of the government. I know it's a little bit of political and political science talk, but let me just ask you anyway that the mandate of a government, one way it can come via vote, but last government didn't have any fair elections, and they had the mandate somehow anyway. For this Yunus government, the people's blood was their legitimacy. People put their blood, not the vote, the blood in the street to uproot the fascist government and put forward a fair government, which is this government. So, what's wrong if this government ran for 5 years to ensure the institutions that were destroyed by the past government are built so that it doesn't fall into the same vacuum where another party or another new government come into the power and do the same as the past government done. Now the question is for you from me is, do you think if Dr. Muhammad Yunus government somehow change their mind and decide to be in the power for some time now, let's say a couple of more years, will this government, in your view, get the approval or the uh, support from the West, especially USA? What do you think?
Yeah, so to just unpack this a little bit. So on the first issue of the legitimacy of this government, I certainly view this as a legitimate government, and I dismiss the arguments of those who claim that this government doesn't have legitimacy because it's unelected. Um, Again, I think that argument doesn't hold water.
Can, can,
That's
can, can you expand on more on this? Why do you think that?
Well, again, I think people get overly wrapped up in constitutional issues, and the Constitution had been amended in the past in such a way as to prevent an interim or caretaker arrangement. But again, I think enough water has kind of gone under the bridge that that argument no longer holds. So um, I'm confident that the fact of this government will be ratified by a future elected government, which is all that's necessary. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that that's all that's necessary really to legitimize the government and most of its actions, right? But I leave that aside. I think it's a mistake to think of this government, this interim government, as just Professor Yunus and his advisors. I mean, the reality is that this is a coalition government, and this coalition includes, the BNP, the Jamaat, and the NCP or the students. So this government works together as a coalition. And what Professor Yunus has made clear is that consensus is going to be the principle which guides how this coalition governs. And that both deals with day-to-day issues, but it also deals with these issues related to reforms. And that's what we're seeing play out in this consensus commission. The issue of finding a consensus on reforms that will then be enshrined in the July charter, and then will begin implementation prior to elections. And I think the reason why the government has decided to operate in this manner is because that is what they believe will enhance the chances that these reforms will last past this government into the next elected government. Because again, this was the problem in 2007-8. The then caretaker government passed through certain reforms, which the next elected government had no intention of seeing through. And then we ended up in the situation we ended up in. So, because of that, and because of the importance of this consensus, I think it's not possible for this government to continue indefinitely or even for a prolonged period of time, because that consensus does not exist. The BNP, which is in some ways the largest member of this coalition, has made it clear that it wants to see elections sooner rather than later. Now, the other parties may have different things that they're saying publicly to respond to some of the interests of the voters that you've expressed. But during my visit, I did not hear privately anyone make a credible argument for this government continuing past the period that Professor Yunus has laid out. Again, I've already stated my view that it's most likely that elections will take place in December, January. I think it would be a mistake at this point for the government to try to stay significantly longer than that, because I think that consensus would fall apart. And then what you would see is you would see confrontation rather than cooperation. Ultimately, this government will be replaced by an elected government. And I don't see any reason why this government should come into conflict with the political forces, which understandably want to see the voters decide who will govern the country.
Okay, but do you think the time that this government got ultimately, if the election is sooner, let's say this September to December, which will be about a year and a half the most, right? Do you think this was a good enough time for them to make all this reform that the country would deserve?
Yeah, so again, I understand the rationale. So the rationale is that if you operate by consensus, then you increase the chances that what you decide upon will last, right? So there's a trade-off there. Maybe you don't get as much as you would have initially hoped, but if you have a better chance of having what you've done stick, then that might be a worthwhile trade-off. Again, we've seen the opposite. We've seen a government stay longer and try to accomplish more, and then ultimately to see the next elected government walk that back. So all of the political parties that are part of this governing coalition have promised that they will continue reforms if elected. Now, their visions of reform are somewhat different. The BNP has its list of reforms, the Jamaat has its, the NCP has theirs. So that's not to say that reform has to end at the end of this government's tenure, but the nature of reform and the process whereby reforms are reached will be different. Because in this period, it will be based on a consensus of all the political parties. In the next period, it will be based on the views of the party which receives the mandate from the people. So ultimately, the people will be the ones who determine how far reforms go. And ultimately, the people will decide whether to reward the next government with an additional period of time to continue reforms, or will give a chance to someone else based on their performance. So I understand the process, and I think it's a reasonable way for the government to be proceeding.
Mhm. All right. Now, in terms of you already mentioned that that BNP is one of the major party in Bangladesh and largest, and many think that if there is a quick election, there is a high chances that BNP will form the government. Now, during the BNP rule, BNP at least rule three times before. Especially the last rule or their period of in the power, one of the biggest concern was corruption and Amnesty International, Transparency International, some international organizations ruled Bangladesh as one of the corrupt country. And I guess you were stationed during that time in Bangladesh as a diplomat as well, at least some period of the time. Um, how do you see this? Do you after I know that you met with the BNP Secretary General Mirza Fakhrul Islam Alamgir and some other people. Do you see that BNP has learned any lesson um, after the Awami League fall, that they will make their country, or they have changed their policy, or they have some lessons how to run the country that won't fall into the same corruption symbol anymore?
So first, I should clarify that I was not in Bangladesh or working on Bangladesh from the 2001 to 2006 period. So I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that. But what I can say is that, I'm not the same person in 2025 that I was in 2006. The Republican Party in the United States is not the same party in 2025 than it was in 2006. Um, the Bangladesh is not the same country in 2025 it was in 2006. So I think we have to accept the reality that people and institutions and countries change. That's not to say that our past isn't relevant. I mean, people do look at past performance, and that's legitimate to do. But I think we also have to look at what people have done and said in the intervening years. And when it comes to the BNP, or for that matter, the other political parties, um, we should take seriously what they've said. We should take seriously their policy documents, the statements by their leaders, and their actions. And certainly at the highest level of BNP, um, there have been some significant changes in terms of what they've talked about um, versus what their party may have done in the past. And then obviously there's the example of what happened over the last, 15, 16 years and the people's reaction to that. So at this point, I'm willing to give all of the parties in Bangladesh the benefit of the doubt, and to hope that they have learned lessons, both directly and indirectly, that they understand that the mood of the country is different after the July Revolution than it was before, that the international community and others who have supported these changes have signaled their perspective and their hopes for the future of Bangladesh, and that we give whichever party wins a mandate the opportunity to show that they're willing to do something differently. Now, there was an old saying during the Cold War from former President Reagan, you trust but verify. So that's kind of the approach that I'm taking. I trust people in the political parties that with what they're saying, but I hope that there are instruments and there are organizations and institutions that will verify, so that if they act in differently than they say they will act, that again, that will come to light and they will ultimately be held accountable by the voters of the people of Bangladesh.
Yeah. You mentioned all the parties, right? You are willing to give a fair chance to all the parties. You also mentioned about Jamaat Islam before in your answers. Now, Jamaat Islam in Bangladesh, which is now probably the second largest party, but it's also the biggest religious party, Islamic political party. Now, Jamaat Islam usually faces two challenges. One is its role during the 1971 War of Independence, where it was not in favor of independent Bangladesh because it feared the Indian influence in the country. Interestingly enough, during the Hasina regime, how India was influencing Bangladesh's economy, the foreign policies, and everything, the people didn't like it very much, and people kind of being little soft cornered to Jamaat Islami. At least that's what the newspapers and other reports says. The second challenges for Jamaat Islami in Bangladesh is they don't have a corruption problem like BNP faced. Their leaders are viewed corruption free largely. Another biggest challenge for them is the relationship between the West, where as an Islamic political party or religious political party, sometime the common intellectuals in the country level them as the same as Al Qaeda, for example, or Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and Jamaat Islami continuously try to distance themselves and level them as a moderate, religious, democratic party. What do you think if, since you said you want to give everybody a fair chance, if in the coming elections somehow Jamaat Islam gets the majority of the vote, do you think USA and the West will give Jamaat Islami a chance, or it will be a huge discomfort among these Western countries to see a political party that has a Islamic or religious label on them is now in the verge of ruling, and there will be some uncooperation from the West side?
Yeah, so it's always challenging to answer hypothetical questions. Um, there's the reality of how Jamaat Islami has performed in previous elections. There have been some polls that have come out that indicate that Jamaat's level of support may currently be higher than it was in the past. And, the sense on the ground from some people I talk to is that there are other kind of data points that support that, although others have questioned whether their support really is as high as indicated in those polls. Again, in a first past the post, system, as in Bangladesh, there's a question on not just the national voting percentage, but constituency by constituency, which candidates will come out first in the election. So there's a lot of factors that will go into this. Um, I think it would surprise most, if not all, observers if Jamaat were to emerge from this election with a majority. Frankly, I think it would surprise Jamaat itself. Um, but ultimately, the decision on how to deal with the elected government in Bangladesh will depend, I think, in large part by how those elections are perceived. If elections are perceived as free and fair, and if a party, whichever party it is, emerges with the majority or is able to form a majority, then my sense is that the international community will give that government a opportunity to govern and to fulfill the mandate. But there's a lot of ifs in that. So I think it's ultimately not that useful to speculate. I think what's more important is that all of the parties see the need to compete for the votes of the people. There's a variety of complicated factors which will go into those decisions, including the quality of the candidates, their views about their corruptibility, views related to economic policy, foreign policy, a variety of other factors. So again, I expect that there will be keen competition in the upcoming elections. And since there are so many voters who have not voted before, there's a big X factor in this election, which will be interesting to watch from outside. And then obviously there's the other big question, which is yet to be answered, which is to what extent will uh, the Awami League or members of its previous 14-party alliance be allowed to participate in the polls? And this obviously will also help determine what the outcome is.
Yeah. All right. Going back to the Rohingya issue, we talked about a little bit. Dr. Mohammed Yunus, when the visit of UN Secretary General recently to Bangladesh, was addressing the Rohingya people, and he was hoping that this Rohingya population who are now refugees in Bangladesh can return to their own land in Arakan or in Myanmar and can celebrate their Ramadan Eid next year. So that is just 1 year from now. And after that, we have seen, due to his team's negotiation with the Myanmar at least acknowledged that about a little more than 100,000 Rohingya, they are willing to return. Do you see Rohingyas are returning to their home country very soon? Is there any obstacle you can see, or what can be done?
Yeah, so obviously it's a complicated and protracted issue, which, personally I was dealing with in the early 90s when I served in Bangladesh. I think the first principle when it comes to refugee return is that this has to be voluntary. So ultimately, the decision about whether Rohingya refugees return to Burma will be made by those refugees. I mean, nobody can make that decision for them. The government of Bangladesh can't force them back. The Burmese government can't force them to return. and the international community is not going to force them to make a decision. So the situation on the ground has to prevail in Burma that makes it attractive for people to want to return. So that's the first thing. Um, there are some serious issues about a protracted refugee crisis, including the humanitarian needs of this community, the costs associated with that. The United States and other traditional donors have indicated that they don't have as many resources available for this purpose as they've had in the past. Non-traditional donors have not yet come forward. There are other, discussions about giving opportunities for the Rohingya to otherwise earn livelihoods, including, through their own efforts within Bangladesh. So again, these are a complicated set of issues. This issue is not going to be resolved by the end of this government's tenure. Although, again, I give credit to Professor Yunus and his team for taking this issue seriously, for engaging with the international community, including the United Nations, for opening a dialogue with the Arakan Army and other actors on the Burmese side, for working with the Burmese government and its international supporters. So this is going to be a complicated problem, which will take some time, I think, to resolve. And hopefully the next government will be able to carry on the work that this government has begun in this regard.
Yeah. You mentioned a couple of success from Dr. Mohammed Yunus. So far, your observation, what is the biggest success of this interim government in your own eye, in your own view?
Yeah. So in some ways, it's a culture shift. And I didn't visit Bangladesh as we talked at the beginning. I didn't visit between 2015 to 2025. And my friends who were in Bangladesh during that time tell me it's hard to explain how stifling the environment had become.
Hmm.
Again, as the government became increasingly authoritarian, as it cracked down on dissent, as the surveillance state ramped up its efforts, as individuals were disappeared, the whole culture of open discussion, debate had been inhibited. Um, Now, even though the elections have not taken place, which are important as part of the democratic transition. I think the broader situation in terms of people's ability to exercise their freedom of speech, their freedom of association, I think those freedoms have been largely restored. That's not to say the human rights situation is perfect. There are still issues and areas of concern. A lot of these related to the weaknesses of institutions, particularly in the justice sector. So there's lots more work to be done. Um, Again, by its nature, an interim government can only achieve so much. The administration, security forces are in desperate need of reform. I think on the macroeconomic side, the government has done a lot to restore stability, to begin to address issues related to the banking system, for example. Um, they are trying to restore investor confidence, and I think the investment summit, which just took place, was an important step in this regard. Certainly, they've engaged with the Bangladeshi diaspora community, which are responding through record levels of remittances. So I think there are a lot of positive signs and a lot of progress that's been made, but there's still plenty of work to be done. I think to your earlier point, this interim government could have continued for some time and continued to have done good things, but at some point, this government's tenure has to end. And I think everyone understands that once the conditions are there for good elections to be held, that should be the priority. And then hopefully the next elected government that comes will have learned these lessons and will be able to carry forward the work that Professor Yunus and his colleagues have done.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned a lot of things positively. Is there any failure or any negative that you have observed this government you expected could do, didn't do, couldn't do?
Yeah, I mean, I think in hindsight, I think even the government would recognize that there are things that they could have done differently. I mean, it was a relatively inexperienced team that was put together at very short notice. Um,
Hmm.
I think in retrospect, had they to do it all over again with perfect knowledge, probably some different decisions would have been made in terms of the size and composition of the government. And that could have potentially made this government's job a bit easier in addressing some of these areas of concern related to for example, reforming the police and the administration and the criminal justice system. So in some ways, those are the toughest issues. So it's no surprise that problems remain. So with hindsight, there are always things one could have done better. But I don't think there are any glaring examples of where this government knew it was doing the wrong thing, but continued on that path. I think this is a well-meaning group of individuals who have done their best and will hopefully leave the country in a better position than they found it. And future generations will appreciate the role that these individuals played at this time.
Yeah, yeah, great. I know we are a little over time. I'll ask you probably three more questions if you allow
Sure.
me. Number one is when the government, the interim government, came into its power, the India and the Modi-led Indian government was kind of disapproving, not meeting the officials, a lot of negative propaganda among the government and the country itself. Very recently, the meeting happened. Mr. Modi met with Dr. Muhammad Yunus in Thailand. And during the meeting, it is reported in the newspaper that Dr. Yunus asked for the handover of Hasina for the trial. Now, two challenges for Bangladesh. One is, as you rightly mentioned before in earlier question, that the trial of the direct perpetrator of this mass killing and the corruption that took place. Number two is channeling back all the money that has been transferred illegally from the country, which is billions in number. How do you see this happening? Do you see India is handing over all these criminal party men, including Hasina, to Bangladesh in near future? And is there any process you can lay out for channeling back all the billions of dollars that has been illegally transported outside of the country?
Yeah, so I mean, on the broader issue, I mean, certainly I think the Indian government missed some opportunities early on to start to develop a new relationship with a new Bangladesh. It was positive that Prime Minister Modi and Chief Advisor Yunus met in Bangkok at the BIMSTEC summit, but it would have been much better had they met last September at the UN General Assembly. Um, then that would have given them much more time to work on some of these issues. But be that as it may, I think on the first issue related to Sheikh Hasina's return, obviously diplomatically, this is going to be a difficult thing for India to handle. I know that the government of Bangladesh wants to hold trials at the highest standard. There are provisions, I understand, under the ICT Act to hold trials in absentia. So even if Sheikh Hasina and others don't return to Bangladesh to face trial, that is not a bar in and of itself for the ICT processes to move forward. There's also discussion about possible proceedings under the International Criminal Court in some kind of concurrent jurisdiction. And we've recently seen the example of the former Philippine dictator Duterte being tried by the ICC. So I think the jury is still out on that issue as well. In terms of the repatriation of stolen assets, my understanding is that the Bangladesh Bank has the lead on this, and the governor of the Bangladesh Bank has had discussions with a number of international partners, both governments and private entities. I've seen some recent discussion of possible settlements involving some of those who looted the country and took funds outside as some point or some type of plea bargaining agreement. Now, my understanding is that Bangladesh's law would need to be amended in order to allow for this, but other countries have found this as a way to, in a shorter period of time, recoup at least some percentage of those assets which were taken abroad. So I think that is worth pursuing. Again, during this government, but that is something that will likely continue into future governments as well. So I think, holding individuals accountable through the criminal process, um, finding some way to recover this money, and then, as I think I mentioned earlier, ultimately some type of truth and reconciliation process as well, which can potentially address lower level individuals who were involved in some of these crimes, as well as those who may have enabled or somehow facilitated the actions of the previous government. So again, these are all important issues which will continue during this government and will likely continue past the election as well.
Yeah, great. Now, let me ask you something differently. USA has some soft tools for diplomacy as well. One of the greatest tool was considered as USAID. The current US government has defunded and I think abolished the USAID. How do you view this action? Do you think, as a diplomat, that makes your job a lot difficult? USAID was a tool for you to perform your job as a diplomat in foreign countries easily and meaningfully. How do you view this thing?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the issue of U.S. foreign assistance, I mean, the U.S. provided assistance to help reconstruct Europe after the Second World War,
Right.
before there was a U.S. Agency for International Development, which was created, by President Kennedy. Um, During a previous time I was serving in the State Department in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration decided to combine the U.S. Information Agency with the Department of State. And
Mhm.
the public diplomacy function, which had previously been conducted by an independent agency, was then folded into the State Department. All of these changes, these bureaucratic changes, are difficult and they create challenges for everyone involved. We're obviously going through a similar period right now. But I think we have to differentiate between the organizational structure the US government uses to deliver foreign assistance from the actual programs themselves. So the indication is that the US government and the Trump administration intends to continue to provide humanitarian and other assistance, but perhaps through different institutional structures. And it remains to be seen exactly how that will look. The administration has its proposals. The Congress will have its input on that as well. And as I mentioned before, even though a number of ongoing U.S. assistance programs in Bangladesh were paused and subsequently canceled, other important programs, including the humanitarian assistance to the Rohingya refugees, was allowed to continue. And I think you see a similar pattern in other countries as well. Um, and I think you have to also step back and ask why this is happening. It's not because all of a sudden the United States government or the United States people have become less generous. I think partially it's based on an assessment of whether these programs are effective. And then, like any government, this administration has to make choices in terms of, whether funding priorities domestically or overseas is more important. And then there's the broader issue of, U.S. fiscal deficits and whether the United States can afford to play the role internationally that it has in the past. So again, it's a time of great change on the international scene and great changes in the U.S. domestic politics. But ultimately, our institutions, I believe, are strong enough to get through this change, and we will emerge on the other side with something perhaps different, but will still reflect U.S. values and interests.
Thank you so much. And this is going to be my last question. And it also involves a little bit of international perspective as well, um, uh, uh, which is, if you notice that just a day before, there was one of the biggest rally in Bangladesh in support of Palestine. Now, USA in foreign countries such as Muslim majority countries like Bangladesh are seen one of the sponsor of the catastrophe that the Palestinian people has been suffering. Now, as a diplomat, how does that impact the local embassies? For example, the ambassador and the other official of Bangladesh, where they have nothing to do with these Washington policies, right? They're there to implement the local US policies regarding Bangladesh. On the other hand, they might see the country they're working for, the vast majority of the people, may have seen them as some sort of collaborator to, in their words, genocide. As a former diplomat, how do you balance this? How do you unpack this sentiment?
Yeah, so again, I think you hit the right word. It's all about balance. So, I mean, first, if you look at U.S. policy, I mean, obviously there are many Americans who have different views on this and other issues. and governments make decisions taking into account the views of the American people, taking into account U.S. interests and goals, and they come up with a policy. Now, in terms of a diplomat serving overseas, obviously we all have our personal views, but at the end of the day, our job as government servants is to faithfully represent the policy of the elected administration. So when it comes to explaining U.S. policy, U.S. diplomats' job is to explain the policy of the administration of the day. It's also the responsibility of U.S. diplomats to accurately reflect back to Washington the reality on the ground. So, for example, if I were serving in Bangladesh at the embassy today, in light of what had taken place on the rally on the 12th of April, I certainly would answer questions from people in the government and otherwise about US policy because that's part of my job, and I would not be doing a service in the country I was posted in if I didn't accurately reflect U.S. policy. But at the same time, I would try to help my colleagues in Washington understand what the perspectives were in Bangladesh, both the perspective of the government and the perspective of the people. We talked before about false narratives. I think one of the false narratives that could come out of these recent events is that this is evidence that Bangladeshis are increasingly anti-American or that there's a rise in Islamic extremism in Bangladesh. First, I don't think either of those are the case. And certainly, I don't think the fact that large numbers of people turned out in support of the Palestinian cause and to protest what they see happening in Gaza, I don't think those are reflections of anti Americanism or Islamic extremism. I think they represent the long-standing views of many Bangladeshi people. Um, so that's not to say that the US and Bangladesh will agree on this issue or that all Americans and all Bangladeshis will agree. But I think what's important is that we understand each other and we understand each other's positions. And we do that as private individuals and we do that as diplomats.
Yeah, you rightly pointed it out. This demonstration, they are definitely the symbol of the rise of any extremists, even though some propaganda may spread around showing these images and whatnot.
Mm,
But that's definitely not the case. That's a long history of religious belief versus the culture, and we cannot just paint them in a broader brush. That will be very wrong. With that note, thank you so much, former Deputy Ambassador to Bangladesh, U.S. Ambassador to Bangladesh, Jon Danilowicz, for your valuable time. And I appreciate all the listeners and viewers who are watching this show today. And I hope you will continue supporting us tomorrow as well. Thank you so much, everybody.
great. Thank you.